Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at a conflict that has the whole world on edge, trying to figure out what's going to happen next.
Yeah, things are definitely pretty tense right now, and we're going to unpack how all the players on the world stage are, positioning themselves and what this might mean for all of us down the line.
And it's changing so fast too, right? Like every day there's something new to consider. It's a lot to keep up with.
Absolutely. And it seems like every move has the potential to completely change, the whole power dynamic.
Okay, so first let's zoom in on what's happening in the Kursk region. It looks like things are really heating up there, right? Reports are suggesting that Russian forces have made some serious advances, and they're pushing deeper into the area.
Right, and that's causing a lot of concern. Some people are saying that a strategic withdrawal might be the only way to avoid a huge crisis.
It sounds pretty serious.
It is, from a military standpoint, of course, but also from a psychological and political one as well. Militarily, it puts a ton of pressure on the other forces, potentially even trapping them, but it goes beyond that. This could have major consequences for any future negotiations and also how the world views the whole conflict.
And then, just as things are escalating in Kursk, we have President Trump making a pretty big announcement on the international stage. He's issued an ultimatum basically demanding that peace talks begin immediately.
Yeah, that's a major development. It's like suddenly the whole dynamic has shifted and everyone has to reassess where they stand. We saw something similar happen when China got involved in the Korean War. This could be a way for some of the global players to kind of flex their muscles and redraw the lines of power.
So Trump is saying, let's talk peace, but what about all the people caught in the middle of this? They're the ones who are really feeling the pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely increasing. There are reports that military aid has been suspended and there are limits on intelligence sharing, and even public support seems to be declining. All of this suggests a very deliberate strategy to force everyone to the negotiating table.
That sounds like an incredibly tough spot to be in.
It is, and it raises a crucial question. How long can things continue without outside help?
Okay, so peace talks seem to be on the horizon, but with all the political stuff going on, it's hard to know who's going to be representing each side.
Right. The current leadership is under a lot of pressure, and it's not clear if they'll have the authority to actually negotiate or even if they'll still be in power by that point.
So basically, a lot of uncertainty surrounding how the whole thing will play out.
Exactly. And we're probably looking at a negotiation process that happens in stages. First, there might be some talks between the U.S. and the involved parties just to establish a basic framework. Then maybe we'd see a meeting between Trump and Putin to kind of solidify things. And finally, only then would we see direct talks between the actual parties involved, maybe with some international mediators thrown in.
So it's not going to be a quick fix. It's more like a complicated dance with lots of different steps, and each one could be its own challenge.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that these talks probably won't lead to any quick solutions or big agreements right away. It'll be more of a gradual process, and the focus will probably be on getting a ceasefire in place and addressing the most urgent problems.
Okay, so peace talks are coming, but that doesn't necessarily mean peace and harmony. There's a lot more to it than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Things are constantly shifting, and the next few months are going to be really important in determining where this whole thing goes.
Okay, so we've talked about what's happening on the ground, President Trump's call for peace talks, and how this might lead to a new world order. But what about Europe? There's been a lot of talk about them getting more involved, but can they really make a difference in the short term?
Well, that's a good question. While there's definitely a push for them to take on a bigger role, their impact might be limited at first. Europe's dealing with its own internal issues, and different countries might end up focusing on their own interests instead of acting as a united group.
It's like a family trying to present a united front, but behind closed doors, there's a lot of disagreement and arguing.
That's actually a pretty good analogy, and that internal friction could end up preventing them from playing a decisive role in the peace process. And that brings up an interesting point.
Oh. What makes that?
Well, with everyone trying to gain an advantage, are there any countries that might actually benefit from this whole situation? Are there any sort of unexpected winners coming out of all this geopolitical chaos?
That's a really good question. It's almost like certain countries are using the distraction to their advantage, kind of leveling up their game while everyone else is focused on the conflict.
Yeah, exactly. Like some countries, for example, Poland and Germany, they might see this as a chance to strengthen their militaries and become more assertive on the global stage.
Wait a minute, a resurgence of German power. Now that's a topic for a whole other deep dive.
It is, and it could have some pretty big implications for the future of Europe, but maybe we should come back to that later. For now, let's get back to the immediate situation.
Okay, so we've covered the changing situation in the conflict zone, President Trump's move to start peace talks, and the possibility of a new world order. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a scary one. The whole nuclear question.
Right, like could this conflict have consequences that go way beyond just the immediate region, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons?
It's a disturbing thought, but it's definitely a possibility. You see this crisis, combined with the fact that there's so much mistrust between the major powers, could potentially weaken the controls we have over nuclear technology. And that might even embolden some countries to start pursuing their own nuclear ambitions.
That's a pretty chilling thought. It adds another layer of worry to an already tense and volatile situation.
It does, and it highlights just how high the stakes are. The decisions made in the next few months could have major consequences, not just for the people directly involved, but for the entire world.
It sounds like we're at a crossroads, with different paths leading to very different futures.
We are, absolutely. The choices made now will shape events for years, maybe even decades to come.
Okay, so we've talked about the military situation, the political maneuvering, the possibility of a new world order, and the concerning issue of nuclear proliferation. Anything else we need to consider to really grasp the whole picture?
You know, there's one thing we haven't really touched on, and it's perhaps the most difficult to fully understand: the role of perception.
Perception. What does that have to do with all of this?
Well, think about it this way. In a conflict like this, information becomes a kind of weapon. Each side tries to control the narrative, to shape how others see their opponent, both at home and on the world stage.
So it's not just about winning battles, but also about winning over people's opinions.
Exactly. And that's why there's such a big focus on things like propaganda, disinformation, and trying to influence public opinion. It's all about gaining legitimacy, about appearing to have the moral high ground.
It's like there's a whole public relations war happening alongside the actual fighting.
Exactly. And it can be just as important in determining the outcome of the whole conflict.
So we need to be really careful about where we get our information and be aware that there might be bias and manipulation going on.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is more important than ever in a world where we're bombarded with information constantly. We need to learn how to filter out the noise and figure out what really matters.
So we've got the military actions, the political maneuvering, nuclear worries, and even this whole battle for perception. What's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should people keep in mind as they follow the situation?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that the world is becoming more and more interconnected, and the consequences of conflict can be felt globally. What happens in one place can have a ripple effect across the entire planet.
Yeah, it really shows how connected everything is these days.
Yeah.
Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Exactly. And those ripple effects, they go way beyond the immediate conflict zone. We could see economic problems, political instability, and even an increased risk of more conflicts breaking out in other places.
So it's not just a regional issue, it's a global one.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand just how complicated this whole situation really is. What happens next could have big implications for everyone.
This deep dive has been really insightful. We've looked at this geopolitical situation from all angles, and it's clear there aren't any easy solutions. But we've definitely gained a better understanding of what's at stake and the different ways things could play out depending on the choices being made.
I agree. It's through these in-depth conversations that we can start to make sense of a world that's always changing and so full of complexities.
Yeah, it reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely. It underscores the fact that we're all connected and our actions collectively, they can have a real impact.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Go ahead.
This situation is constantly evolving. It's unpredictable, and it's full of potential turning points. The story is far from over, so stay tuned.
Yes, and in the meantime, keep asking questions, exploring different perspectives, and trying to understand the world around us better.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure talking about all of this with you.
Likewise. Until next time, subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.